The icy afternoon cast its weight over Los Angeles, like a grey veil smothering any hint of hope. The cutting wind whistled through the streets of Skid Row, sweeping debris from one side to the other and making even more evident the state of abandonment of that gloomy place. Skid Row, known as the epicenter of destitution in the United States, seemed like a separate world, where time did not flow as in the rest of the city. Among improvised tents, plastic bags danced to the will of the wind, while tired and downtrodden figures moved slowly, as if each step were a battle. Inside a luxurious car, passing through those forgotten streets, Barron Trump was sinking into the comfort of a soft leather back seat. Despite the sophisticated environment surrounding him, his mind wandered far away, distracted by thoughts that seemed to echo an unrest, difficult to name. His gaze lost itself through the tinted windows, absorbing the brutal contrast between the comfort he lived in and the misery paraded outside. Suddenly, something broke his contemplation. Amid the chaos of the sidewalks, between piles of trash and shadows of lives that seemed forgotten by the world, his attention was captured by a figure. It was a woman, hunched under a thin, worn blanket, seemingly unable to protect herself from the cutting cold. Her fragile body trembled slightly, but there was something about her that transcended that image of desolation, something almost familiar. Barron felt a pang in his chest, a sensation as sudden as it was strange, causing him to frown. He leaned slightly forward, as if approaching the vision could make sense of that unexpected whirlwind of emotions. The memory of a long-forgotten feeling tried to emerge, but escaped like smoke between his fingers. Life is an unpredictable wheel that can turn at any moment, throwing us from one extreme to another without warning. Today, we may be surrounded by comfort and stability, but tomorrow always holds its surprises. In 2 years, 5 years, everything built with effort can collapse in an instant, leaving us at the bottom of the pit. Barron Trump had always known, in theory, that fate could be cruel, but he had never felt this truth so viscerally as now. The discomfort that had invaded his heart was not something he could simply ignore. There was something about that woman, hunched on the sidewalk, that seemed to resist the attempt to push the thought away. He averted his gaze for a moment, pressing his temples, as if that could dissolve the strange feeling that dominated him. However, the more he tried to forget, the more that face, worn by time and sadness, persisted in his mind. Her deep, empty eyes carried a story that didn't need to be told in words, yet still weighed like a scream. And then, like a lightning bolt, the realization struck him. The impact was so brutal that he could barely breathe. Barron knew who she was. The hunched and almost unrecognizable woman before him was none other than Mrs. Henderson, the same woman who, years ago, had taught him to read, who encouraged him to dream big when no one else believed in his potential. His mind plunged into a whirlwind of memories as his chest was crushed by the weight of reality. How was it possible that Mrs. Henderson, such a dedicated and wise teacher, was now reduced to this? He blinked several times, trying to absorb what his eyes insisted on showing. That sight didn't make sense. Such a noble woman, who had dedicated her life to shaping young minds and inspiring hearts, shouldn't be there, abandoned and invisible. Something was deeply wrong with the world, Barron concluded, when people like her were discarded as if they were irrelevant. The red light forced the car to stop for a moment, but for Barron it seemed time had frozen. He leaned forward, as if trying to see better could dissipate the disbelief. His heart raced, and his mind seemed to run in 1,000 directions, but one thing was clear. He couldn't simply ignore that scene. As he watched her struggle to keep the blanket over her shoulders, her thin fingers trembling against the cruel cold that dominated the city, a knot began to form in his throat. Everything inside him screamed that this wasn't right. It was a kind of injustice that wounded the soul, demanding a response. A part of his mind, perhaps the most pragmatic, insisted that he should move on, that this situation wasn't his problem. But another voice, stronger and impossible to ignore, clamored for action. Memories of Mrs. Henderson in her glory days began to invade his thoughts. She wasn't just a teacher. She was a force that transformed lives. He could see her clearly, meticulously preparing her lessons, her contagious energy as she encouraged each student to believe in themselves. She was the kind of person who left lasting marks, who shaped the character of those who crossed her path. But life, in its cruel unpredictability, had torn down everything she had built. First came the illness, a blow that kept her away from the classroom she loved so much. Then, the devastating loss of her husband, leaving her helpless in the midst of pain. For a while, she still had her children as a source of hope, but promises that should have been unbreakable unraveled over time, leaving her alone. Barron felt a deep chill as he realized how much she had lost, how the world seemed to have taken from her mercilessly. He knew he couldn't let that moment pass unnoticed. Something needed to be done, and he would be the one to act. Mrs. Henderson took a few moments before lifting her head, and when she did, her eyes reflected an overwhelming emptiness. Her expression was tired, marked by years of struggle, but for a brief moment something surfaced behind that exhaustion, a flicker of recognition. Her gaze met Barron's, and at first it seemed she couldn't believe what she was seeing. Her voice escaped, weak and almost inaudible, laden with shock and a hint of shame. Emotion took over her. Her eyes quickly welled up, and she instinctively tried to fix her disheveled hair with dirty hands, as if she could somehow erase the marks of what she'd become. But there was no way to hide reality. It wasn't just the act of being recognized. It was being recognized by one of her former students, someone who once saw her as a figure of strength and wisdom. The weight of that realization seemed overwhelming. She wished Barron didn't have to see her like this, broken, forgotten and discarded by the world. But he didn't avert his gaze, didn't turn away. On the contrary, he saw her truly, saw everything that time and adversity had taken away. For a moment, both remained silent, as if the past and present had collided in an overwhelming way, trapping them in a bubble where only that unexpected encounter existed. Barron took a deep breath, realizing that hesitating wasn't an option. "Come with me," he said with a gentle firmness that seemed to carry the strength of a promise. Mrs. Henderson looked at him, unsure. Life had already taught her not to trust, not to believe in gestures of kindness. Her experiences had convinced her that hope was a cruel trap. However, something in Barron's gaze made her hesitate. He didn't wait for her to respond. With an outstretched hand, he offered her a choice she didn't know if she could accept. She hesitated, her heart torn between the instinct to reject help and the overwhelming exhaustion that screamed for relief. Her eyes darted between his face and the dirty ground, while her mind battled against shame and distrust. But deep down, she knew she didn't have the strength to refuse. With a heavy sigh, her thin and fragile fingers touched his hand. It was the first time in years someone had touched her without contempt or indifference, and the gesture carried an almost unbearable weight. Barron guided Mrs. Henderson to the car, the silence between them more eloquent than any words. He noticed everything, the way she walked with difficulty, how her bones seemed about to pierce her thin, worn skin. The cold still made her tremble, even inside the warmth of the vehicle. Barron felt his chest tighten as he realized how fragile she was. It was like watching someone who had lost all battles, someone who never had the chance to rise again. As he drove, he finally broke the silence. "What happened?" he asked, his voice softer than he expected. Mrs. Henderson closed her eyes for a moment, as if she needed to gather strength to revisit the painful memories. Then, in a low and resigned tone, she began to tell her story. She spoke about the illness that kept her away from her passion for teaching, about the devastating loss of her husband, and about the betrayal of her children, who abandoned her at the moment she needed them most. Each word cut Barron like a blade. He listened, powerless, as she described the relentless descent into despair, selling the house to cover medical expenses, the humiliation of seeking help that never came, and finally, the fire that destroyed everything she still owned. Barron gripped the steering wheel tightly, his thoughts spinning in a storm of emotions. He wanted to believe that situations like this were rare, but he knew they weren't. What impressed him most wasn't the story itself, but the way she told it. There was no anger or bitterness in her voice, only exhaustion, a bitter acceptance that the world had forgotten her. When Mrs. Henderson finished, she kept her gaze fixed on the window, as if expecting Barron to judge her. Perhaps she was used to being blamed for what had happened, to hearing that she should have done something differently, but Barron didn't say any of that. He remained silent, swallowing the storm inside him, determined not to let her being the last page of her story. Without a second thought, Barron took Mrs. Henderson to a 5-star hotel. When they arrived, she looked around with an expression of confusion and disbelief. Her face said it all. She felt she didn't belong in that place. But Barron didn't let himself be deterred. He got out of the car and extended his hand again. "Let's go," he said firmly. She hesitated. Her feet were dirty, her clothes torn. Shame burned in her chest like an unquenchable fire. But this time she didn't resist. With hesitant steps she followed him. Inside the hotel, curious glances and whispers spread, but Barron didn't care. He went straight to the reception and asked for the best available room. He knew it was just the beginning, a simple gesture, but one that carried immense meaning. In the room, Mrs. Henderson turned to him and asked, her voice choked with emotion, "Why are you doing this?" Barron took a deep breath, a soft smile lighting up his face. "Because you never gave up on me," he replied. "Now it's my turn." The soft morning light streamed through the hotel window, enveloping the room in a golden glow that seemed almost magical. Sunbeams danced across the pristine white sheets, while the distant sounds of the city remained muffled, creating an absolute contrast to the reality Mrs. Henderson knew. Slowly she opened her eyes, feeling the soft touch of the pillow against her skin. For a brief moment she didn't know where she was. The softness of the mattress, the clean scent in the air, the absolute silence. All seemed like a dream. Then realization came, along with a wave of emotion that tightened her chest. Memories of the previous night returned, and she needed a few moments to process what had happened. As someone who was used to fighting for every moment of dignity, being in that environment so far from the harshness of the streets was disconcerting. She didn't know how to express gratitude, and even more, a small voice in her mind whispered that maybe she didn't deserve so much. The soft sound of the door opening brought her back to the present. Barron entered the room with a light smile, carrying a tray with a simple yet comforting breakfast. He placed the tray on the table and looked at her with kindness. "Did you sleep well?" he asked, his voice carrying a tranquility that seemed almost therapeutic. Mrs. Henderson nodded, though she was still struggling to believe that it was all real. In the following days, Barron moved mountains to ensure she had everything she needed. He took her to doctors, made sure she had a safe and comfortable place to live, and even provided financial support to help her start a new chapter. But more important than any of these actions, he gave her something that time and circumstances had taken away, the feeling that she mattered, that she was still seen as a person worthy of care and respect. The transformation was slow but undeniable. Every small gesture, every step taken with Barron's help seemed to rebuild something inside her that had been destroyed. In weeks, Mrs. Henderson was almost unrecognizable. Her demeanor, once weighed down by exhaustion and shame, now carried a renewed light. It wasn't just the fact that she was clean or wearing new clothes, it was the hope that shone in her eyes. Barron knew that providing financial support or a roof was just the beginning. He wanted to give her something more meaningful, a chance to reclaim her identity and purpose. So he helped her find a role in a community teaching program aimed at underprivileged children. When she held a piece of chalk in her hands again, it was as if a part of her soul, lost for so long, came back to life. The classroom, simple and humble, became a sanctuary where she could channel her passion for teaching. The children looked at her with curiosity and admiration, and gradually she regained confidence in her ability to make a difference. The children's laughter, the attentive looks as she explained simple concepts, were a reminder of who she was. When asked why he did all this, Barron's answer was simple and direct. "She taught me to be someone. Now it's my turn to give back." Their reunion seemed more than a coincidence. It was a powerful proof that small acts of kindness can resonate deeply and change lives. For Barron, it was an opportunity to honor the person who had believed in him at a time when he needed it most. For Mrs. Henderson, it was a chance to believe again in the goodness of the world. If this story touched your heart, be sure to share your thoughts in the comments below. We would love to know how this journey of compassion and redemption impacted you. Don't forget to like this video to help spread this powerful message of hope and love. And of course, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss more inspiring stories like this one. Together, we can spread more light and hope in the world. Thank you for being part of our community.